The Butcher of Baltimore, a journey into the human abyss. You now stand at the edge of a swamp in the industrial outskirts of Baltimore, late 1990s. The air is heavy, mixed with the smell of stagnant water and mold. It is here, at this threshold between civilization and wilderness, that our story unfolds, a story that demands not only our horror, but also our analytical courage. I am your guide on this expedition into the archives of crime, and today we will examine the case of Joseph Metheny, a man whose biography reads like a treatise on the banality and monstrosity of evil. Before we meet the man, we must understand his world. Baltimore in the 1990s was a city of violent contrasts. A declining economy had left in its wake abandoned factories and a flourishing underworld of drugs and prostitution. The streets were marked by the crack epidemic that devastated entire communities, creating a vacuum where law seemed distant and survival was the only currency of value. Industrial neighborhoods, once vibrant with the sound of machines and factory whistles, now echoed only with the silence of decay and the whispers of despair. It was a perfect ecosystem for predators. Metheny, a man with an imposing physical constitution, weighing over 400 pounds and standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, and a history of violence, was an organic product of this environment. He was not the stereotypical serial killer, the sociopathic genius from movies. He was, in the words of crime historian Harold Schechter, an example of the common monster, one whose brutality arises from a combination of trauma, opportunism, and profound desensitization. To understand Metheny, we need to go back in time. Born in 1955, he grew up in a dysfunctional family marked by abuse and neglect. His father, an alcoholic factory worker, abandoned the family when Joseph was still young. His mother, unable to cope with the responsibility of raising 6 children alone, frequently resorted to violence as a form of discipline. These are not excuses, but context, fragments that help us map the psychological territory where monstrosities can germinate. Metheny served in the army, and according to reports, witnessed and possibly participated in acts of violence that marked him deeply. When he returned to civilian life, he found work in factories and shipyards, but his inability to maintain stable relationships and his volatile temperament made any stability difficult. Alcohol and drugs became constant companions, further dulling any residual empathy that might have existed. The breaking point, according to his own narrative, came when his wife left him, taking their son with her. Consumed by rage and abandonment, Metheny embarked on an obsessive search for her, convinced she was living among the homeless and drug users on the outskirts of the city. It was during this search, he claims, that he committed his first murders, killing people he believed knew of his family's whereabouts. This narrative, however, must be examined with skepticism. Serial killers often construct personal mythologies that attribute their acts to a specific moment of trauma, an attempt to impose narrative order on the chaos of their own compulsions. You now enter the bar that Metheny operated, attached to a decaying motel. It was a place that functioned under the logic of anonymity, where questions were not asked and gazes were avoided. The peeling walls and the persistent smell of stale beer and tobacco created an atmosphere of desolation that repelled the curious and attracted those seeking to escape their own lives. Here, he recruited his victims, mostly vulnerable women involved in prostitution and drug use. The methodology was insidious in its simplicity. He offered shelter, drugs, or a paltry sum of money. The promise of comfort was the bait for the trap. These women, invisible to broader society, became perfect targets. Their deaths would go unnoticed for days, sometimes weeks. No one would search for them urgently. No one would pressure the authorities. They existed on the margins, and it is precisely on the margins that predators like Metheny thrive. What happened inside that bar and in the surrounding swamplands is difficult to reconstruct with precision. Physical evidence was limited, partly because Metheny himself had destroyed much of it, and partly due to the nature of the swampy terrain that quickly consumed and decomposed any trace. What we do know comes primarily from Metheny's own confessions, which must be approached with careful critical analysis. According to his statements, he would lure women to isolated locations where he would assault and murder them. The violence was extreme and personal, involving strangulation, blunt force trauma, and stabbing. But it was what came after the murders that transformed Metheny from a brutal killer into something that haunts the American criminal consciousness even today. I want to make it clear that no matter what the jury or anyone else thinks, I am not a monster. Yes, I ate the flesh of some of my victims. It was tasty, but I am not a cannibal in the traditional sense. I was just making hamburgers and selling them to customers. Stop for a moment, read the quote again. As a historian, I find in this passage a primordial document. It reveals not only the act itself, cannibalism and the alleged commercialization of human flesh, but a desperate and distorted attempt at rationalization. Metheny clings to a perverse logic of commerce and pragmatism to justify what is, in essence, the outrageous violation of all civilizational taboos. He becomes, in the words of philosopher Tsvetan Todorov, the radical other, one who lives completely outside the social contract. The claim is horrifying in its specificity. Metheny alleged that he would dismember his victims, mix their flesh with pork and beef, and sell the resulting hamburgers from his roadside stand to unsuspecting customers. The image is so grotesque, so fundamentally transgressive, that it challenges our ability to process it rationally. We are forced to confront the possibility that ordinary people, going about their daily routines, might have unknowingly participated in this ultimate desecration. But here we must pause and engage our critical faculties. The forensic verification of these claims was never conclusive. No customers came forward reporting illness or discovering human remains. No physical evidence definitively proved that human flesh was served. This raises crucial questions. Was this claim true? Or was it an elaborate fantasy designed to maximize psychological damage? Was Metheny constructing a myth of himself, ensuring his place in the pantheon of America's most notorious criminals? What does Metheny's story teach us about the nature of serial violence? First, we must examine the phenomenon of victim selection. Metheny saw his victims not as people, but as merchandise or product. This is a central characteristic in many serial killers, particularly those who target marginalized populations. Prostitution, in the distorted mind of the killer, transforms the human body into an object of transaction, a conceptual step that facilitates its subsequent objectification into pieces of meat. The sociologist Jack Katz, in his work on the seductions of crime, argues that criminals often experience their acts through a distorted moral framework that inverts conventional values. For Metheny, the commercial language, making hamburgers, selling to customers, served to normalize the unspeakable. By framing cannibalism and murder within the mundane vocabulary of American commerce, he attempted to strip these acts of their moral weight. The swamp and the bar were not merely murder locations, they were extensions of his psychopathy. They were liminal spaces, borderlands, where the rules of society did not apply. The swamp, in particular, is an archetypal symbol of the unconscious, the repressed, the place where things can be hidden and decomposed. In American Gothic tradition, from the bayous of Louisiana to the marshlands of the Chesapeake, swamps represent zones where civilization's veneer dissolves and primal darkness emerges. Moreover, Metheny's choice of Baltimore's industrial wasteland speaks to broader themes of American decline. The post-industrial landscape, with its abandoned factories and forgotten workers, creates spaces where surveillance is minimal, and social bonds have frayed. These are the hunting grounds of modern predators, places where the social fabric has torn enough to allow monsters to operate with relative impunity. Criminal psychologists have long studied the phenomenon of the organized versus disorganized killer. Metheny presents an interesting hybrid. His selection of victims and his use of a consistent location suggest organization and planning. Yet the extreme brutality and the alleged cannibalism suggest a profound disorganization of the psyche, a complete breakdown of the inhibitions that normally prevent such acts. Dr. Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist would likely score Metheny high on factors including lack of remorse, shallow affect, and parasitic lifestyle. But psychopathy alone does not explain cannibalism. This requires an additional element, what forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz calls paraphilic predation, where violence and consumption become eroticized and fused with identity. Metheny's confession, with its almost proud tone and twisted logic, can be interpreted as a performance. He was, in the end, constructing his own legend, conscious that the magnitude of his acts would guarantee his infamy. He was not just confessing, he was narrating his own mythology of perversion. This performative aspect of serial killer confessions is well documented. From Ted Bundy to Dennis Rader, killers often seek to control their narrative to ensure they are remembered not just as criminals, but as exceptional criminals. Law enforcement's pursuit of Metheny was complicated by several factors. The transient nature of his victims meant that missing persons reports were often delayed or never filed. The jurisdictional complexities of crimes spanning multiple locations in and around Baltimore created coordination challenges, and Metheny himself was careful to a degree in selecting victims who occupied society's blind spots. His capture came not through brilliant detective work, but through his own escalating recklessness. As is common with serial killers, the intervals between murders decreased, and his victim selection became less cautious. In 1996, he was arrested after attempting to lure two women into his trailer. One escaped and reported him to police. When authorities searched his property, they discovered evidence linking him to multiple disappearances. During interrogation, Metheny was remarkably forthcoming, even eager to discuss his crimes. This is another pattern we see repeatedly. The killer who, once caught, wants to talk. Whether driven by narcissism, a desire for recognition, or psychological relief at finally being stopped, these confessions provide invaluable, if disturbing, insights into the criminal mind. Joseph Metheny was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial itself was a media sensation, with journalists from across the country descending on Baltimore to cover what was being called one of the most grotesque cases in American criminal history. The prosecution presented evidence of at least 2 murders, though Metheny claimed the number was much higher. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, pointing to Metheny's history of head injuries, substance abuse, and childhood trauma. However, his detailed confessions and the calculated nature of his crimes made this argument difficult to sustain. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts. The case, however, remains shrouded in certain shadows. The allegations that he sold human flesh hamburgers to customers were never forensically verified conclusively. It is crucial to distinguish between the confessional narrative, a historical document in its own right, and incontestable material evidence. The possibility exists that this was part of a fantastic elaboration designed to inflict even greater psychological damage on society and the families of victims, or to cement his status as the ultimate butcher. Several forensic experts have weighed in on the plausibility of Metheny's claims. Dr. Michael Baden, former chief medical examiner of New York City, noted that while cannibalism among serial killers is rare, it is not unprecedented. Cases like Jeffrey Dahmer and Albert Fish demonstrate that this ultimate transgression does occur. However, the commercial aspect, selling flesh to unknowing customers, remains unverified in any documented case. Matheny's case resonated in American popular culture in ways that reveal our complicated relationship with true crime. He appeared in documentaries, inspired fictional characters, and became a staple of most evil killers lists that proliferate online. This commodification of horror raises ethical questions about how we consume and process extreme violence. The journalist and author Philip Gurevich argues that our fascination with serial killers reflects a desire to understand the boundaries of human behavior, to peer into the abyss while remaining safely on the edge. Matheny, with his outrageous claims and brutal acts, provides that ultimate boundary case. He pushes us to the limits of what we can comprehend as human behavior. Yet we must be careful not to sensationalize or mythologize. Behind the lurid headlines are real victims, women whose lives were cut short, whose families were devastated, whose existence has been reduced to footnotes in a monster's story. Kathy Spicer, Catherine Magaziner, these were real people with dreams, struggles, and value. The tragedy is not just what happened to them, but how easily they were forgotten by a society that had already marginalized them. Joseph Matheny died in his cell at the Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, on August 5, 2017. He was found deceased, apparently from natural causes, at the age of 62. There was no dramatic final statement, no last-minute revelation. He simply ceased to exist, as unremarkably in death as his victims had been forced to cease existing. His death prompted a wave of online commentary, much of it celebratory. "Good riddance," "Rot in hell," "Justice served." These were the common refrains, and while understandable, this response also reflects our tendency to externalize evil, to place it safely outside ourselves. Matheny becomes the monster, the aberration, the exception that proves the rule of human decency. But Matheny was not a supernatural demon. He was a man, and it is precisely in this corrupted humanity that the true horror resides. A horror that history, in its mission to understand the totality of human experience, cannot afford to ignore. He was produced by a specific time, place, and set of circumstances. He was enabled by social structures that rendered certain populations invisible and therefore vulnerable. He was the logical endpoint of a society that commodifies bodies and discards people. Understanding Matheny does not mean excusing him. Rather, it means acknowledging the uncomfortable truth that monsters are made, not born. That the capacity for extreme violence exists within the human psyche under certain conditions. That the distance between civilization and savagery is shorter than we want to believe. As we close this chapter, we are left with difficult questions. How do we prevent future Matheny's? How do we protect the vulnerable without further stigmatizing them? How do we satisfy our curiosity about extreme cases without exploiting victims or glorifying perpetrators? These questions have no easy answers, but they must be asked. The swamp where Matheny hunted still exists, though it has been partially developed. The bar where he lured victims has been torn down, but the psychological and social swamps that enabled his crimes remain. They exist in every city where poverty, addiction, and marginalization create populations that society would rather not see. Until we drain these metaphorical swamps, until we extend full humanity to all people, we will continue to produce predators who exploit the vulnerable. Joseph Matheny's story is not just about one man's depravity. It is about what we as a society permit, what we ignore, and what we must confront. It is a mirror held up to American darkness, reflecting uncomfortable truths about class, gender, and the value we assign to different lives. And that perhaps is the most disturbing lesson of all, that the real horror is not just what Matheny did, but the world that made his crimes possible.